Hi, Alex. Welcome to our Tuesday webinar at
Yeah,
the
good
Macrobiotic
evening.
Center of Toronto.
Good evening, Alice. Good evening, everyone. Happy to be here, meet you.
Great. So before we get started with your lecture, just wanted to talk to you a little bit about your background. We know that you've written or co-authored or written a ton of books over the years on macrobiotics and philosophy, cooking, and so on, and that you were a big presence at the Kushi Institute and exposed last year, 2 years ago. What have you been doing since then?
Well, since then, we've reorganized our activities under the umbrella of Planetary Health Incorporated. And this was a nonprofit that we started about 20 years ago, primarily to sponsor the Amberwaves network to protect rice, wheat, and other grains from the threat of genetic engineering. So in California, we organized against Monsanto, who was planning to come in and introduce GMO rice. We were successful, and so ever since, this country has been free of GMO rice and wheat. So we succeeded, but it was a lot of organizing and petitions and meeting people in Washington. We worked with Dennis Kucinich very carefully, congressman from Ohio, who's now running.
He was a congressman.
Now running for governor. Anyway, it was a traditional campaign to mobilize public opinion, and so we were successful. But meanwhile, as an educational organization, we've been involved with publishing small books and booklets over the years. We've had musical events and teach-ins and workshops and that kind of thing. So when the Kushi Institute closed, then we reorganized, starting with the Macrobiotic Summer Conference. And we have a new location now, also in the Berkshires, at Eastover Holistic Resort in Lenox, which is right down the road from Tanglewood Music Festival and Kripalu Yoga Ashram. Anyway, it's a very beautiful community in the Berkshires. And Eastover has about 600 acres, really beautiful. So it's located, we like to say, on the main meridian, right down from Mount Greylock, which is the largest, tallest mountain in Massachusetts. It's a straight line for about 10 miles. So it's like this big meridian of energy that comes into Eastover from the mountains.
It's
And
beautiful.
so we had the summer conference last summer, and we're planning for this year's summer conference. Well, it'll be from 1 week, July 29th till August 4th. And we have about 25 teachers, counselors, and cooks coming, including you. And
That's great,
so we're looking forward to a great event and love to see.
Great last summer. It was the location accommodations are beautiful. And well, Liz is coming back. I'm coming back.
Okay. Well, that's great. Yeah, well, we hope everyone can visit.
Yeah, and you've got a new a webinar, a new show called Me So Happy, the Me So Happy Show. Is that?
Yes, I've been working with Bettina Zumdek, who was one of the longtime KI teachers. And so we've been working together to establish what we call a learning and variety show, the Me So Happy Show. Mm-hmm. And we have special guests, something like this show, but we hope to have, we've had music and cooking segments and humor and something like a Macrobiotic Prairie Home Companion type of show. And
you've already, I missed your first show last week because I was tied up, but it's once a month, right?
It's on the first of every month, so it's easy to remember. And you can go to our website, mesohappyshow.com, with more information, and also you can get the tickets to the show. It's very affordable, and we're going to have Marlene. The next show actually is, we're going to be in London giving a seminar, 9-Star Key seminar on June 1st. Mm-hmm. And so we're teaming up with some of the Macrobiotic longtime teachers there, like Marlene Watson-Terra, Simon Brown. Anyway, it's going to be another great show.
Oh, wow. Oh, okay. We'll look forward to that. And so we go to misohappy.com.
Misohappyshow.com.
Oh, miso.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So last summer at the summer conference, there was a lot of talk about Awned rice, and we had Christian Elwell
Yes.
he gave a presentation, and Liz and I came back with brown rice to grow. So Liz and I planted brown rice, and at the end of this presentation, I put a picture on, that can be shown on the computer, because I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or 7 sprouts, and they're doing quite well. One is about 4 inches tall already. So we'll see what happens. I hope that I manage to take them to maturity and able to have some grains to plant next year. I'm very excited about it. But you're now going to talk to us about the importance of brown rice, organic brown rice, and more importantly, Awned rice. And you're going to tell us about Awnds and what's happened to them and how important they are for our nourishment and spiritual development.
Yes, I'm going to put it into a context of a subject that I've been researching and working on for the last few months. So it's going to be talking about Awned rice, but in a cultural context, which I think hopefully people will find really interesting. But I'd like to start my presentation with sharing with you a dream that I had earlier this spring. And in the dream, I was counseling a patient in the hospital. And it was an old woman, and she was in one of those hospital beds, and she had all of the tubes, in her arms and perhaps in her mouth, and some kind of breathing apparatus. She was having trouble getting enough oxygen and proper nourishment, and was really, really in decline. And so I was sitting next to her in a chair, giving her macrobiotic consultation and talking about the importance of a grain-centered diet. And then particularly, I started talking about Awned rice or other Awned grains. And Awnds, for those of you who don't know, are the long bristles that grow at the end of grains in the field. And those long bristles are something like antennae. So they're able to gather energy from the cosmos, from the sun, the moon, the stars, anyway, that kind of higher vibration. And it goes into the actual growing rice. So even though the awnds, those long spiky things, are discarded when the rice or barley or wheat is harvested, that high energy is in the grains. And that's another reason the grains are such a wonderful food for all levels of our development. But this is particularly at a spiritual level, you might say. So anyway, I was counseling her about the importance of Awned grains in my dream. And then I noticed that by the side of the bed, there was a little table, and there was a clipboard, something like my own clipboard that I keep with me. And it was with her medical kind of records of prognosis. And I looked at it, and it had her name inscribed at the top. And her name was Mrs. Aska, A-S-K-A. And I knew immediately what was going on, because I knew who that was, that name. And I don't know, maybe Alice, maybe you remember, maybe some of the friends in the audience also remember, who've taken Michio Kushi spiritual training seminars. But Aska was the name of the ancient, what he called the ancient one peaceful world civilization, that kind of legendary one world civilization in megalithic or pre-megalithic times, that in Europe, Asia, the Americas, Africa, there was kind of a unified world, which was very peaceful and spiritual. But then over time, because of the change in energy and some astronomical alignments and so forth, great Earth changes took place. And naturally, that whole ancient time collapsed. And so it's remembered in legend and myth, like in Atlantis or Mu or some of those kind of stories, or the Great Flood in the Bible. Mm-hmm. So he said that was the name of the actual community was Aska, and that kind of a vestige of that is still today remaining in place names, geographical names around the world. For example, Alaska, Nebraska. Oh. There's Indian tribes in Canada called the Athabascans, right?
Yes, Athabascans.
Athabascans. And in Europe, you have the Basque people in Spain. Oh, wow. Yeah. And in France. You have cities like Glasgow, Moscow. Middle East, you have Damascus. All over the world, there are cities, there are valleys, there's rivers that have Aska kind of buried in them as kind of a reminder of that ancient one peaceful world civilization. Wow. So anyway, when I saw that, I woke up at that point in the dream because I knew exactly what was happening. You know who the woman was that I was giving counseling to? It was so clear. It was Mother Earth.
Mother Earth, of course. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. She was in, she was near death. It was on life support. Yeah. Couldn't breathe, couldn't eat. So I was giving her macrobiotic consultation. Yeah. So anyway, that kind of was kind of a message, I think, to carry on Michio's spirit, but also our common dream of humanity to create one healthy, peaceful world and restore the earth and everyone on it. So anyway, that was kind of a prophetic dream. Wow. So that's kind of a lead up to my talk this evening. And so I prepared a slideshow, and I'm going to be focusing in this presentation not just on rice, but actually on a whole culture which was devoted and grew out of Awned rice in Africa. And this is a historical culture. It's not a legendary culture. As much as I like Michio and his wonderful stories about Aska and that ancient world, it was wonderful to hear about those. These are still, in the kind of vibrational field or memory somewhere. But whether they really, truly existed, it's still kind of a question mark. But what I'm going to talk to you tonight is about an actual, real historical civilization, in fact, that existed, which was entirely peaceful. And it was a brown rice civilization. So let's begin. I'd like to take you to, as I said, now to Africa, to the Cradle of Civilization. And I think, as most of us know, our human beings, including many proto-ancestors, what scientists call homonyms, evolved from the monkeys, the apes, the chimpanzees. This was millions of years ago. And this took place primarily in the savanna. Those are the ancient grasslands in Africa. And some of you may have heard of one of our ancient ancestors by the name of Dinkinish. That's an African name meaning you are marvelous, or perhaps better known by Eve. That was the skeletal remains that were found, 20, 30 years ago by the Leakeys, famous archaeological anthropology team in East Africa. And Eve is said to be the mitochondrial mother, the kind of the generic mother Eve of humanity. She lived about 4 million years ago. She was from what's called the Australopithecine line. So she was fully upright, but only one of the many ancestors prior to Homo sapiens. Anyway, in Africa, as we come up then to the Homo sapien line that developed about 300,000 years ago, human culture began to divide, particularly when it left Africa, the so-called out of Africa, into Asia, Europe, and other parts of the world. It divided into two streams, which mythologists call the Gondwana and the Laurasian stream of culture and mythology. The Gondwana, which was, we believe, the original culture in Africa, in the heart of Africa, was more of a plant-based culture in which the cosmos was created by a God that kind of left things pretty much up to human beings. And so they developed by harmonizing with animals and with plants. And it was more, you might say, a vegan or vegetarian oriented culture. And when our ancestors, one stream of that left Africa, they went south to India, to Southeast Asia, to Australia, to those kind of southern places. They carried those kind of myths with them and they perpetuated those. So those kind of cultures continued to have a more vegetative orientation. Whereas those people who left and went into Asia Minor, the Middle East, then into Europe, then into Russia, China, and eventually into the Americas, they were more influenced by hunting because it was a colder, often more glacial type of climate and environment. So some of this is very natural to have a hunting mythology. But those kind of myths eventually then became the kind of myths where the heroes would slay the dragons, see, and they would end up being kind of military myths of conquest. So two very different streams of human culture came out of Africa. All right, so let's now go to West Africa, and I'm going to be focusing on what's called the Niger River civilization. The Niger River is the third largest river in Africa, and it begins in the highlands of Guinea, in the mountains. This is a mountainous region here. And then it flows kind of northeast up toward present-day Mali. This up here, this sandy area, is actually the Sahara Desert. And you can see Timbuktu, which was a historic city that developed in the Middle Ages, kind of at the bend of the Niger River. And then the Niger River takes a right, and it flows through present-day Benin and Nigeria and empties into the Gulf of Guinea. Anyway, the Niger River, like the great river deltas in the Nile, Mekong, Amazon, Yellow River in China. Anyway, it's a very fertile region. And so it's perfect for cultivating grains. And as I said, just above this region is the desert, but the desert was not uninhabited. There were, of course, what we call Bedouins or people with camels and flocks and so forth who traveled back and forth. And interestingly, they left petrographs. These are ancient symbols, kind of proto-writing. And so this one, I think, is about 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. This antedates all any kind of written alphabet or hieroglyphics in Egypt. Anyway, it's a sleeping antelope. Anyway, very artistic, very beautiful. Okay, but south of the Sahara then is the Niger River Delta. And this is a typical photograph of the Delta, where you have little islands, estuaries, peninsulas, and communities of people living very closely together. In fact, there were cities in ancient times in this region, as there are today, towns and villages and many other things. In fact, the main grain here is brown rice and has been for thousands of years. And the rice, interestingly, in Africa is a native species. It's related to the Oriental Asian rice, but it's a different species. And for the most part, it is Awned. It's I have the name in one of the next slides. We'll see the name.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And interestingly, the main culture bear in West Africa was called Chihuahua, who was half antelope, half human. And he was said to be the inventor of rice farming and taught it to human beings. And he was the son of the sky goddess and the earth god. And many of the cultures today, thousands of years later, continue to celebrate, as they grow rice today, this Chihuahua figure. And you can see here the photograph on the left has a stylized antelope, which is a male antelope. You can see the horns are slightly curved at the top. And the one on the right, to the right of that, is a female antelope with straight, slightly smaller, with straight horns, and on the back is the baby antelope. You see that? Yeah. So they perform and they wear these antelope masks, and they dance and they celebrate the gift of grain that came from the antelope. And actually, I recently got a Chihuahua mask.
Wow.
Yeah, I had it made from West Africa. It was made by artists today. Mm-hmm. And it's wooden, but it has a little bit of metal inlay, and it's hand painted. I don't know if you can see it. It's really
beautiful.
Yeah,
is that stylized antelope on the head? Like the headpiece is that representing
the antlers, and this is it's kind of a crown, and then this is the eyes here and the long nose.
Yeah.
And then the mouth. Yeah. You'll see many of the human figures actually have this very similar physiognomy to the antelope. Anyway, the antelope was considered to be the great culture bearer for this whole region. Yeah. So, as I said, African rice, which is called Oryza glaberrima, that is the Latin name, was actually cultivated from wild rice. So the African wild rice is called Oryza bartili. So this is a different species. The Oriental rice is known as Oryza sativa, and it comes in several varieties. It has the Chinese and the Japanese called japonica, and then the Indian called indica. So there are several different species of rice. Another cousin actually is wild rice in North America, which is actually somewhat closely related to these rices. And it was interesting because biologists for many, many decades said, oh, wild rice has nothing to do with regular rice. Right. But recently, through DNA testing, they found that they were actually closely related. And they separated at some point when the continents, east and west, separated. All right, so this photograph here, if you can look at it closely, you'll see that it has these long, thin awns at the ends of the rice. Can you see that? Yeah, this is
very fine. Yes,
they're very fine.
You have a pointer. You have a pointer on your screen. Alex, if you look at the bottom.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you want to use that. But yes, they're very faint, but you can see them. Or they're faint to me because I'm.
Okay, I'm trying to. Yeah, I was using my cursor.
Oh. I see. Yeah.
Can you see that?
Now we can see the pointer. Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, those are the awns. Yeah. Yeah, they say, so that absorbs and gathers the cosmic energy. So when we eat on rice, well, as you know, we had it at the summer conference. It gives a totally different feeling. It's much lighter. You feel much brighter. I don't know, things start to kind of move. The interesting thing is that, as you can imagine, because these long, pointy things, there's something like the thorns on the rose, you might say, that they have many functions. Not only do they gather energy, but they protect the growing grain from animals, from insects, from deer, from antelope. So that when they're harvested by human beings, it's an extra step to take them off. In other words, when you hull the rice, you have to take off the awns, and it's much easier to take off rice or other grains that don't have the awns. And through trial and error, occasionally there would be some grains that had no awns. So they were collected historically, particularly in Asia. So historically, almost all of, as far as we know, most all of Chinese and Japanese rice for thousands of years has been awnless, has no awns. And so today when you buy rice, natural food stores or California rice or whatever it may be, chances are it has no awns because it's been that way now for millennia. Here and there around the world, there are still some awned rice, an indigenous rice grown in a valley or a mountainside or something. And in Africa, apparently, they still have some of the largest amounts of awns. Though some of the African rice also now is awnless. And one of the just
so how did this research? How did the awned rice discovery or rediscovery come about?
It's an interesting story. For years, Michio had been lecturing about the virtues of brown rice, right, versus white rice.
Yeah.
Virtues of rice versus other grains. It was the most whole, the most complete. And he often mentioned the awns. And we just assumed that the rice that we were eating, the organic brown rice from California or from the American South or Italy or Spain or wherever, was awned. But then about 2 years ago, my colleagues Bettina and Edward Esco, we were talking about awns and about rice, and we checked, and we discovered that actually none of the rice that we've been eating was awned.
Oh, wow.
And
that was shocking to me. That was shocking when I found out.
It was shocking, yes. We had no idea because we just assumed that it was awned.
Yes.
And in fact, I've been out to the to Lundberg Farm several times, though I must say it was during the winter, so I didn't see the actual grain in the field. But because we were working on the Amberwaves project, trying to protect rice from GMO, so we were working closely with the Lundbergs and with other rice farmers, but we were not, so to speak, out in the fields, and probably even if we were, we wouldn't have picked up on it at that time.
Yeah.
But when we started to investigate, suddenly we discovered that there's almost no awned rice available. So fortunately, we were able to find a farmer. Well, this is where Christian Elwell comes in. Christian Elwell is the founder of South River Miso Company, which is a longtime macrobiotic company here in Western Massachusetts. And Christian, kind of as a hobby, has been growing grains for about 30 years for his own use, for he and his family. And it turns out that he found a strain of awned rice originally from Russia and the Ukraine. And so he was able to grow that and used it every year since. And it was actually it was a dryland variety. In other words, it wasn't paddy irrigation rice, but it grew in the land like wheat or like barley, just with rainwater or a little bit of occasional irrigation. And so he knew all about awns. And so we were happy to find him. And then he directed us to a farmer in Maine who he had given some seed to, commercial young group of farmers who were now growing for the first time an Awned commercial crop. It was still very small, but we were able to secure, I don't know, 100 pounds or something, which we used for our summer conference. And we've been distributing a little bit of it ever since. So that was a huge discovery for us. All right, so the complement to grains in traditional societies, as most of us know, are beans and bean products. And in West Africa, they have a whole variety of beans, of course, but one of the main ones is called locust bean, which is pictured here to the top left. And actually, it's fermented, one of the applications, and it's made into a paste that is very similar to miso. In fact, I call it the African miso. It's called iru. And it's used for soups, for condiments, for special dishes. And they have different types of fermenting methods and periods of fermenting, and something like what the ancient Mayans, they use wood ash, with maize, they use wood ash to help with these beans. Anyway, it's a traditional fermented food for this whole region. They eat with the brown rice.
They use wood ash in Canada too.
Okay, yeah, I'm sure all over the world, traditional people. Yeah, to supply minerals. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, now one of the most amazing things about this ancient civilization, which goes back to the early centuries before the Common Era, is that they had no rulers, no weapons, no armies, no war, no government. There's no evidence of any coercive authority at all. This is really amazing, because almost all of the civilizations that we've been brought up to believe were kind of the foundation of human culture, like Egypt, like Mesopotamia, like China, like Greece, like India, Vedic culture, for example, or many of the Inca and Aztec type cultures, were total opposite of this, right? They were very highly stratified societies with royalty, with privileged elites, and eventually they all had big armies and were engaging in colonialism, conquest, and war. So this is amazing civilization. It lasted for 1,500 years. And it wasn't, believe it or not, it was an Iron Age civilization. It actually very highly skilled ironsmiths and smelters. But they didn't use metal for weaponry. They used it for, guess what? For cooking utensils, for ceramics, for jewelry, for toys, right? Artwork. Totally peaceful application of metallurgy. And so they would trade with surrounding cultures, particularly the trans-Saharan trade. But the culture itself was made up of kind of affinity groups, or what we call today NGOs, non-governmental organizations. So this would include farmers, artisans, spiritual societies, weavers, carpenters, many different things like that. And they actually had cities, 40 to 50,000 people. This is huge, right? Really amazing. Yeah.
And it's not that far in the past, really. It's fairly recent.
Well,
it's not like 20,000 years ago.
No, not at all. That's why I say it's a historic civilization.
Yeah.
But it was only discovered in the late 1970s, totally unknown until that time.
Yeah.
Archaeologists discovered it for the first time. So it's virtually in none of the history books yet. But it began to change in the Middle Ages, and we'll look at that as we continue presentation. This slide shows a graphic of the actual archaeological dig in Degene Degeno, which is considered the main city or the so-called capital for this whole ancient civilization. And so it goes down many different levels of digging there. And that's just a architectural or archaeological map of the dig. Okay, now this culture was primarily an oral culture, and the historians, the keepers of memory throughout Africa are known as griots, sometimes translated as bards, but they also served as praise singers, diplomats, prophets. They were the people kept the legends and the myths and the wisdom and passed it down from one generation to the next. And there's the great African epic, which is centered in this region, is called Sundiata. And it's the great Mali epic, medieval epic about the Lion King. In fact, the Disney cartoon was based on this story loosely, called The Lion King. And one of my favorite passages has to do with, because this was the era when writing was just now coming into West Africa and displacing this oral culture that had existed for 1,500 years. And in the epic, it states, other people use writing to record the past, but this invention has killed the faculty of memory among them. They do not feel the past anymore, for writing lacks the warmth of the human voice. So this epic, it tells the story of Sundiata, who we meet in the beginning of the story as a boy, actually a prophecy that he will be born and become the great king who will unify all of West Africa. But he is a cripple. He can't walk as a child. And his mother is a hunchback. And because of the prophecy that he will rise to become the new leader of Africa, he's exiled by the usurping king and the usurping king's family. And so they go into exile with their griot, with their bard, with their musician. And they go through many different challenges, kind of a wisdom quest. And interestingly, the antelope.
Alex, can you tilt your screen a little bit so we can your face is sinking. Yeah. Better.
Okay, yeah. So the antelope plays a key role in the epic. In fact, it's the antelope who were introduced in the opening of the story. The antelope leads a hunter to this kingdom, and the antelope sacrifices itself in order for the prophecy to be made. Anyway, it's that culture bearer, Chihuahua, that I mentioned. And throughout the epic, then there are kind of references to the antelope. And when Sundiata finally becomes a strong young man and regains his ability to walk and or normal activity, his griot says, room, make room. He's now become a lion. He's no longer an antelope. Anyway, this is very beautiful passages about his growing up story. And one of the other main characters in the story, you'll be happy to hear this, Alice, was a young woman named Lela. She's the best cook in all of the land. And so she's kidnapped by the evil king in order to cook for him and the army to give them a strategic edge. And so
Wow.
a lot of the action has to do with getting her back, rescuing her, so she can cook for the good guys rather than for the usurpers.
This has all the makings of a great. This has a great drama. It's got the makings of a great series, television, Korean drama, except African dramas.
Well, yeah. I'll mention that later. In fact, it influenced the recent
Is that sushi?
Kushi?
Sushi.
Oh, sushi. No, that's brown rice, and I think it's that iru,
Wow.
that miso-like concoction.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's an African sushi, but anyway, it's not a Japanese or a yeah. Okay, after Sundiata then was victorious, one of his first measures was to introduce what's called the Mandan Charter, the African words for which are Kurakan Fuga. And this charter guarantees everyone the right to life, preservation of physical integrity, tolerance among family members and intergenerations, guarantees childhood education. Women have to be represented at all levels of government, bans mistreatment of foreigners, protects animals, has a humane military code. Anyway, it's one of the great documents for human rights, and it dates, get that, 1236. That's almost the same time as the Magna Carta in England. Yeah. Early.
Wow.
Yeah, within 10 years of each other. Amazing. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is one of the great documents of human rights. Okay, as I mentioned, there was trade between the civilization then, and particularly going through the Sahara to North Africa. So this photograph shows camels, and those big white bags on the camels are all salt. That was the main commodity from the desert. And so they would bring salt south to West Africa, and in turn they would load up with food or with gold, of course. They loved the gold, which is very plentiful. And eventually, in the Middle Ages, and slavery begins. So this period, Sundiata, that epic, was the beginning of what we call the rise of the mighty African empires. And there were quite a few. The best known are Ghana, not to be confused with present-day Ghana. It was a large empire filling up most of Western Africa. Mali, Songhai, and others. And these medieval empires were very similar, you might say, to those in Europe or in the Middle East or Asia. They were fighting among themselves. So they were empires of conquest, of territoriality, of weaponry, and eventually of slavery. So this was a huge change and marked the end of that peaceful civilization. And horses and chariots came in from North Africa and the Middle East. And then the iron that had been used peacefully now was used for weapons, for arsenals, for fortresses, and for all kind of military preparations. So this is pretty much like the rest of the world now at this point. A lot of conflict ensued. Now the diet now changed dramatically during the Middle Ages. Of course, rice, millet, and veggies were still eaten, and they play a big role in the epic, which kind of was composed orally, during this transition time. But now animal food begins to be consumed in really large quantities. Before, it was always for special occasions. They're very small amounts and primarily fish or seafood. But now you get beef eating on a large scale, you get poultry, and of course, with Islam coming now, all of these big empires are basically Muslim empires through conversion. And with Islam comes sugar from the Middle East. And so when you get meat and sugar together, I think, as most of us know, then this is a combustible combination. And so this is kind of the biological foundation for the war, the slavery, the conquest, and all the disorder that now begins to characterize this part of the world. And the other yin, besides sugar in this area, of course, they had fermented alcohol from rice and millet, but it's now eaten in much higher strength and quantity than before to balance the animal food, but also you have many more spices. Some spice, of course, is natural in this area, but again, it'd be taken up to a higher level. And one of the big spices, cola nuts, of course, becomes famous in the 19th and early 20th century as the main ingredient for Coca-Cola, Pepsi-Cola. Okay, with the coming of Islam, Timbuktu then becomes the great center for Islamic learning. And this is kind of, as I said, it's right on the desert, right before the desert, and kind of northwest of the Niger River. And it's more in a millet growing region. Millet was grown in the more arid regions because it didn't require as much water, and there wasn't as much water. And so these large palaces and universities, mosques, a lot of monumental kind of architecture now begins to characterize this region with coming of Islam. But this city in particular was a center of education, and it taught not only Islamic subjects, but also in general astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and all the other arts and cultures. And about a quarter of the population for this city was students or teachers. And there were estimated 1 million books in Timbuktu, largest library in Africa since the burning of the Library of Alexandria by the Romans, over a millennia earlier. Okay, African art is very famous, and originally in this region was devoted to masks, metalwork, sculpture, fiber arts, and other more peaceful representations, either animals, plants, or human beings. And some of them were naturalistic, some of them were more abstract. And this figure on the left here is probably one of the most famous sculptures in African art. It was in the Louvre in Paris, in the museum for many, many years. And it shows, I like to call it the African thinker, like Rodin's thinker. That big sculpture with the person sitting. Yeah. And it has the long, elongated chin. It's like the antelope's chin, somewhat. And anyway, very elegant hairstyling, body adornment. And you can see the coloring and the sandy coloring, and actually the hair, the way that the hair is braided is very similar to the architecture in Timbuktu. I'll go back to that slide. You see that? The mosque? Yeah. Very similar. Yeah. See, these come from a millet growing region. This is a little different than rice. Anyway, this particular sculpture goes back to that ancient peaceful civilization. So it's at least, 1,500 to 2,000 years old. And the antelope.
Millet has awns. They haven't removed the awns from millet, I understand, or have they?
It's a little unclear. It appears that they have very small awns. Millet is a very young grain, so perhaps that it's not quite clear to me how much awn is millet, how much millet is awned or awnless. But antelopes, interesting, also play a role in other civilizations, particularly in the ancient Minoan civilization in the Aegean, Mediterranean, and also this is from a fresco in Crete, and then this is from the ancient Indus Valley civilization in modern-day Pakistan and North India. And in fact, the main culture bearer is believed to be this. There are three animals here. There are three different heads, but at least one of them is believed to be the antelope. So we have to do more research, but actually both of these civilizations were also peaceful civilizations for approximately the same length of time. They were somewhat contemporary with the African Niger River Valley civilization. They were both peaceful, no evidence of war, no battle deaths, no massacres, no weapons. Really unusual civilization. So Africa was not the only one. There are actually several around the world, and these are two, and antelope played a big role. Now this sculpture is from the Middle Ages, coming up another 1,000 or 1,500 years from the thinker. And it's still very beautiful and stylish, but you can see it's a soldier. And he has a quiver for his bow and arrow on the back. And his horse here is a horse for, raiding or conquest or whatever. So the artwork begins to take on a military cast in the Middle Ages. And again, this is a result of increased animal food, sugar consumption. Okay, in West Africa, there's a concept called niyama, which is very similar to ki energy in the Far East, or prana in India. It means life energy. And it was said that everything has niyama: people, places, animals, rocks, stars, the waters, right? And that the people who are skilled, who have this kind of energy, which can be cultivated, something like farmed, are known as niyama kalwa. People who are have strong ki, and they cultivate the ki energy. And interestingly, the main group of people in the ancient times who were known for their ki were the blacksmiths, the iron workers. And their group had to do with fire, because they were communed with the spirit of fire. And the fire spirit was said to be one of the most powerful spirits. So anyway, the proper use of fire and water, and but other societies like carpenters, musicians, and eventually sorcerers who used it for both good and evil. But anyway, it's a universal concept in Africa, ki or niyama. And so these three, this was like an iron worker here on the left, just a modern drawing of one. Anyway, you can see the kind of the ki energy for a stylized tree and one of the old sculptures here. And those pictures I just selected to show kind of modern examples of ki in action, or niyama in action. You have the antelope leaping. This is a boatman on the River Delta, Niger Delta. These little long dugout canoes. And you know what this is?
Like an elephant trunk.
It's an elephant trunk.
Wow.
Isn't that a great picture?
Yeah.
Yeah, learning from elephants. Amazing.
Yeah. Whispering in his ear. Yeah.
Yeah, whispering. Okay, now coming up to the modern times, you might say that this traditional African culture was first rediscovered by the modern artist around 1900, and particularly by Picasso, but also by some of the other artists, particularly the Cubists. And Picasso, when he first saw the African mask and the sculpture in the museums in Paris and in Spain, he had an epiphany. And he said that it changed his whole outlook on life. He said there was a turning point in his life when he saw African art, because he said for the first time he realized that as an artist, he doesn't have to portray the external world, the world of representational art, that art could portray the inner world as well. And it could portray both of them together. So that was the birth of Cubism and some of the other types of abstract art in the early 20th century. And so this is often said to be, equivalent to like Einstein's theory of relativity, or some of, those great paradigm changing events, because it changed the whole direction of modern art when Picasso tapped into this. And some of his greatest paintings, then you can see the influence on like Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which was probably his most famous painting, which he started. Some of the characters actually have these mask-like big faces. And then Guernica also has the influence very clearly, his great anti-war painting during the Spanish Civil War. So this was one of the lasting legacies of this whole culture. The antelope, Tiwara, it was specifically the antelope mask that he said was the one that changed him. Okay, so the legacy of the Niger River Valley civilization in the Middle Ages, unfortunately, and then coming up to modern times, then after that period of conquest, intertribal, interstate rivalry in Africa itself, then the European cultures came into West Africa, first with the Portuguese, then with the French, and then with the English. And so they were stronger militarily and were able then to begin to set up what was called the transatlantic slave trade. And so Timbuktu fell into kind of disuse over the years, became a byword for the ends of the earth. But the African kind of flame of freedom continued during the imperial era for 2 or 3 centuries, even though it was suppressed, but it began to come out again in the early 20th century, about the same time as Picasso. So you had the early freedom movements in India and Africa and around the world, the anti-colonial movements, which then finally achieved political independence beginning in the 1950s, with Ghana, which was the first African country to win its independence in 1957. And then all the other states, including Mali, followed. And then, as I mentioned, Djenne Djeno, that ancient capital city, was only unearthed in the late 1970s. And the excavations continue today. And UNESCO recently recognized that Mandan Charter as one of the great human rights charters for humanity, on the level of Magna Carta or Declaration of Independence or UN Bill of Charter of Human Rights. Anyway, it's right up there as one of the top documents of all time. So in conclusion, I would say that this culture, which was based ancient civilization based on eating whole grains, but particularly on grains, offers us a model or paradigm today for a healthy, peaceful civilization. And again, we don't have to look back to Atlantis or some, ancient one peaceful world, as much as I like to think and read and fantasize about those ancient times. This is real. This actually shows that human beings can live peacefully and in harmony together. So it offers us a lot. And then I like to just mention in closing that I don't know if any of our friends saw the recent Black Panther movie, but it was the #1 movie, I guess, in North America until the Avengers just took over. But it's about a utopian African society, and which was actually, it's called Wakanda in the movie, but it's lightly based on many traditions in Africa, including the Niger River Valley. In fact, the antelope mask played a role in the movie. So here and there, they actually had many of the antelope masks.
Well, I'll have to go see it now.
Yeah, it's definitely worth seeing, because again, it offers a whole different kind of view of Africa than we've been brought up in the history books. Yeah. So the final thought I'd like to leave people is that the antelope, please think about the antelope, because the conclusion I came to was that the antelope, perhaps more than any other being or animal or figure in the whole history of human evolution, was our immediate ancestor. When we talk about evolution, we talk about human beings evolved from monkeys, from chimpanzees, from apes, right? There's that modern evolutionary line, and it's clearly that our physical being evolved from them. But that whole family of primates, what were they eating? They were eating fruit, right? They were eating nuts. They were eating seeds. They weren't eating grains. But guess who was eating grains? Antelopes, gazelles.
Oh.
So naturally, those were the ones who taught humanity. It makes perfect sense. Those were the animals that were eating the wild grains for tens and thousands of years. So it's the wisdom of those animals, the grain-eating animals, that was transferred to human beings. It's so clear. It wasn't the monkeys. Though we inherited a form from the monkeys, but our mind, our spirit comes from the antelopes. And again, if you go back to my last picture, you look at or that other picture, the leaping. These beautiful gazelles and antelopes, they leap, right? They're very agile, they're graceful, they're dancers. So a lot of our music, our culture, and our flexibility and all of those kind of things, it's much more antelope and gazelle-like than it is monkey-like, isn't it? Anyway, something to think about.
I had no idea that there were any animals that ate green.
Oh, absolutely. They are. And that's what they eat. They eat wild grains and other vegetation. They're vegan.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I thought they ate, I guess, is like animals that eat grass would naturally be eating grains as well.
Grains is a form of grass. It's a part of the grass family.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So they eat many types, not, so that's amazing. Yeah. So that whole cultural tradition was that the animals were the original farmers, and they taught that to humanity.
Yeah. Wow. That's amazing.
So that's it's a huge evolutionary cultural breakthrough to realize our ancestors were antelopes, gazelles. I think in South America.
Well,
I think it's another lecture, but in South America, they have different, they don't have antelopes and gazelles, but they have llamas and alpacas and vicunas, which are very similar. They're vegan.
Well, yeah. Well, energetically, if they're eating whole grains and we're eating whole grains, there is a connection.
Absolutely. Sure. Yeah. Well, that's the whole point. Yeah. So it's that kind of connection through consciousness.
This is a fascinating lecture. This was really, I learned a lot shows my ignorance. A lot I didn't know. I had no idea that there was such a culture.
Nobody does.
It's not a short time ago, eh?
Yeah. I mean, it's virtually not in the history books. I mean, archaeologists know about it here and there, and there's some beautiful.
Well, you just hear about, you have this vision of Africa. There's just like who knows? It's really dark there. You don't know what happens. There's slavery. People
Yeah.
eat sorghum. They starve. You know, that's like, it's terrible how
Yeah.
little we know about the culture.
Yeah.
Fascinating. So we have some questions, and then I'll open it up, but there was some questions people wrote in. Is Canadian wild rice on? Good question.
I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah, you'll have to go out and check. You have to get your canoe and
We have to find out. There's actually no, there's actually at the local farmers market, there's Aboriginal people that harvest wild rice. We'll have to ask them, find out.
I would
Ask them to bring
imagine
us some
if it's if it's truly wild, it would probably be on. If it's a kind of
It's
a
not farm. It's not farm because they're always fighting with landowners that are destroying the habitat. So
yeah, when that case, it would probably be on.
How did you learn all this?
How did I learn this?
Sorry.
What is the question?
Said, how did you learn all of this, Alex? Have you studied African history and archaeology? How did you learn all of this?
Oh,
Have you studied African history and archaeology?
Well, I mean, I'm a writer, I'm a researcher, I'm a teacher, so I'm constantly learning and studying. And I can just say about this whole study is that, you know, years ago I wrote a book with Michio called One Peaceful World. And in that book, we laid out that story about kind of Asuka and that ancient One Peaceful World community. That was a large part of the book. And then we had a historical section in the book, but it was mostly about the cultures that we know, Egypt, Sumeria, Aztec, Inca, China, etc., you know, which are very mixed societies. There was a lot of violence, a lot of warfare. And we had a dietary interpretation of that, but we didn't have any model of a historical peaceful society.
That's right.
So when I kind of stumbled on this earlier this year, I was totally astonished. I'd never heard of it before. And the more I got into it, all of these things, it just kind of came into place. And meanwhile, you know, here and there, I've been eating some on grains, so maybe my antenna were a little more attuned to this.
Maybe it sparked something.
It started sparking something, yeah. So that's
so interesting. That's a question that often, I mean, I've often asked myself, well, I haven't found any evidence of any culture that wasn't warlike. I mean, you know, the Japanese eat rice, the Chinese eat rice, Indians eat whole grains, etc. But there's no, this is the first time that there's an example historically of a society that's maintained a culture, a peaceful culture for such a long period of time.
Well, as I said, there actually are other civilizations, and these are future lectures on particularly the Minoan civilization and on the Indus Valley civilization. And I'll just give you a hint.
Yeah.
Both of those cultures, their main grain was barley. And barley, interestingly,
oh wow, yeah,
is on. Even today, almost all the barley is on. It's unlike rice. The barley actually, when you take the awns off barley, it gives smaller yields and other types of attributes. So historically, even though it's kind of a chore to process, farmers kept the awns. So today, virtually all the barley in the world, traditional barley, is awned. So barley is a wonderful grain to use in cooking, and you know, for, of course, it's used for beer, it's used for many things. So you're actually getting some of that energy, awned energy, when you're eating barley products. Also wheat. Most wheat is awned. Same thing. It's the whole photosynthesis and is actually enhanced by having awns, whereas in rice, taking off the awns actually gives better yields or something. So that's why they have different properties.
Oh, somebody said they found images of Canadian, oh, Liz, Canadian wild rice, and it looks not on. And barley is traditional to Tibet to this day. So
Tibet.
Liz is asking, well, it's okay, go on, and sorry, interrupted you.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, barley is traditional in Tibet, and throughout the Middle East still. Greece, yeah.
Liz is asking if you're suggesting that we are descendants physically from antelopes.
Well, I said not physically, but energetically and spiritually. So our form and our structure is more
should we?
Like primates, but I think, but our energy, because the antelopes and the gazelles are eating wild grains, they're more dancing, they're more joyful, they're more active, more flexible than the monkeys. But the big difference between us and antelopes, though, keep in mind, is that we cook our food. See, they don't cook. Or maybe they do, but it's, proto-cooking. Maybe they take the rice grains, they put them on hot rocks. Some animals actually do that. So they have proto-cooking.
Oh, really?
Yes.
Really?
Almost all animals actually warm up their food in one way or another. It's a fascinating field. That's a whole nother lecture. But
we have so many lectures. You have to come back. So should we let's see, what animals warm up their food? Well, that's for the next lecture maybe.
But many birds do. They'll catch fish and then drop them on hot rocks.
And then, yeah, Liz, she's never heard of that. Yes, stick to Tuesday evening webinars. We are just a source of little known facts and hidden culture. So I'm going to open this up to discussion and see what happens. I'll keep the recording on because you can edit out if it's a technical fiasco, okay? But, okay, so here we go. Okay, it's in discussion mode. So whoever wants to participate, please click on your screen. Oh, and I want to show the picture of my rice while we're waiting for that. Look, isn't that amazing?
Yeah, that's pretty.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Liz, how's yours doing? Is your rice more sprouted than mine? Or more? Is it taller? Liz can't hear. Whoa. Are you there, Liz?
Yeah, here.
How does your rice compare to mine? Oh, you're showing us. Can't see. Let's see. Put it on big. Oh, wow.
Yeah. And then this guy.
You have more than me.
Yeah. And then this guy. Not so great. And there's my
fantastic. So one grain, 10,000 grains.
Yeah. We can hope, Alice.
Wow.
I think
wow. You're going to have a farm. Yeah.
I think my rice needs more sunlight. I just feel that it's not getting, and I know it needs full sun. So, but I'm reticent to put it outside because.
Do you have headphones, Liz? Headphones?
Yeah, sorry.
Headphones. Okay. Yeah. I think you should put them on because there's too much noise. Oh, what, Cornelia, this is my rice. I'm growing Awned rice. It's a picture of, it's inside still because it's been too cold, but I'm going to put it out on my balcony where there's lots of sunlight. So at the summer conference last year, Christian Elwell gave us some seeds. And Liz, so Liz and I are going to become rice farmers now that we've reached retirement age. Right, Liz?
Yes.
We're going to compete with South River miso.
Yes, for sure. I always dreamed that I would have a
I
raspberry
don't think
farm.
anybody's growing rice in Canada.
No, I think you're right,
Raspberry
Alice.
rice.
Yeah.
But no,
And
I don't think
Christine,
anybody is growing it in Canada.
I think you're right. I think you're right. But if they can grow it in Maine, we could certainly grow it in the south of Ontario. But I have to get the hang of it because I really like the way your rice looks really good. And got some little weeds coming up there. But you have more water on your rice than I do on mine. And I
just watered it. But
did you?
I can't tell if they're weeds. I don't want to pull them in case they're rice.
The ones that are closest to the front of the picture, those are weeds.
Yeah,
And the
I know.
other ones are rice. They look really great. Where do you have that? By your back window?
My dining room window. There's lots of sun.
Yeah, the big full story window kind of thing. Yeah, so it gets a lot of sun. Yeah.
Any questions for Alex?
Oh, Alex, that was so interesting. So much stuff that I had no idea about. And it just, yeah, the whole civilization in Africa, and I just really had no idea. It was really great.
Yeah, I'm glad you enjoyed it. Yeah, it was a revelation to me too.
Yeah, I bought a bag of Awned rice when I was at the conference last year, and I tried to notice if I could feel any difference, and I didn't. But I'm not a very good macrobiotic practitioner, so I'm kind of have dulled senses, I think. Yeah. So I want to get more and keep trying it and see.
Anyway, yeah, keep trying it. But growing it yourself is a wonderful experience. I did that too, like Alice. And
wow.
Yeah, you get to commune, with an individual rice plant, and
sure.
I don't know, it was just a very special experience.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Any farming is great. I can hear myself.
In Toronto, somebody actually. Yeah, I know. I think because Alex doesn't have headphones next time. He's going to have it for next time. But in Toronto, I read online that somebody was growing rice at a community farm. They have
in
those
Toronto?
in the city. And
Yeah,
he grew a plot of rice. Yeah, I think.
Oh.
And he grew it one summer. He grew a bed. Yeah, but he didn't continue. He was just trying to see if it would work.
Yeah, like an experiment. Yeah. And I think
so. Brian, you're on there. How do you? Sorry, Liz.
No, it's okay.
Liz,
I think growing grains is really important because I'm not confident that the mass commercial producers will always be able to produce what consumers require because of, like drought and extreme weather event and stuff like that. So providing it for yourself, I think, is a really great idea.
Food security. So, Brian, how are you related to Alex? Oh, he's gone.
Yeah, I remember in the Amberwaves book, Alex said that one of his ancestors from the Pease family moved to Ohio. And my family also was the Pease family that moved to Ohio.
Oh, wow.
Whereabouts in Ohio?
Northeast Ohio.
Okay. Do you remember what town or?
Well, I live in Cleveland, and I think in your book you just mentioned that they moved to Ohio, and the name Pease stood out to me. So
yeah. Well, they lived in Huntston,
In Huntston?
Yeah,
I'll have
it's
to
a
look that
little.
up.
It's in Northeast Ohio, and
Okay.
and anyway, the story was that my I don't know great 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 one of the great grandmothers eloped from Boston with one of the young men or sons of the Adams family. It wasn't John Adams, but I think it was one of Samuel Adams' family, during the Revolutionary War period.
Mhm.
And they set out on horseback because that was the main travel at that time. And they rode west to the Western Reserve.
Yeah.
The Western Reserve was, the kind of uninhabited territory beyond Massachusetts and New York, upper New York State, which included present-day Ohio. That was the boundary at that time. That was the western boundary of the United States. And so they settled in some little crossroads there in Ohio. And anyway, so that's at least my side of the Pease family.
Oh.
That's how they got, yeah. And then they were there for, I don't know, they're not there anymore, but they were there up until, I don't know, 1950 or abouts.
Mhm.
Yeah, so they were farmers. At least most of my grandparents on that side were farmers, and in fact I remember as a child visiting them in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
And that was in Ohio as well?
In Ohio, yeah, in that it's Huntsburg, Ohio, Huntsburg.
Mm. Yeah, I'll have to look it up and see if our
Yeah, see if you can
the same
look it
lines.
up and yeah.
Small world.
Anyway, we're related in more ways than one, perhaps.
That's right. Okay, well, if there's no more questions, then I'm going to let Alex.
Can I just ask one question? Or maybe it's a big question.
Sure.
Do you have thoughts, Alex, on the impact of climate change on our diet and our energy? I thought your story about Mother Earth and her dying is very apropos.
Yeah, I do. I think, just very briefly, yeah, I'm very concerned about climate change and global warming, and I think it's had a tremendous impact on our food quality. I can almost give you another lecture on this, but for example, it's changing the nutritional profile of all foods and crops around the planet, so that the actual, quite apart from the energetic effects, the nutritional effects are totally amazing, and they have not been. There are few scientists who are actually reporting on the changes, but they haven't even percolated into the nutritional world yet. And they're astonishing. For example, the ratio of protein to carbohydrates is changing dramatically. Protein, the amount of fat, macronutrients as well as the smaller nutrients. So it's skewing everything, just the same way that the migration of animals, plants, birds, and insects, right? It's totally skewed now. Yeah, so it's having the same effect on our crops. Anyway, Alice, before we adjourn, I'd like to just mention some further resources to the friends here. Is that I'll be giving. We're going to be giving a 9-star key seminar online on May 19th and 20th. And Bettina Zumdek and myself, we're going to be giving it in England. And we're giving it live, but we're hoping to film it as well. And a video very similar to this format. So you can get details of that on our MisoHappyShow.com website if anybody would like to participate. It's a 2-day seminar, and we'll be giving five classes, an hour and a half each, on different aspects of Nine Star Key, which is a kind of a cosmology and Oriental astrology. It's going to be a fascinating lecture series.
May 19th.
Yeah, it's going to be recorded too. So if you can't see it, you can download it or record it for later viewing. Yeah.
Okay, super. You guys have been really busy.
Anyway, we're trying to keep the flame alive. In fact, I had a dream of Michio last night talking about dreams.
Yeah.
Only thing I can remember though in that dream was he had a good appetite. He says, I want you to have dinner with me.
Aww.
Then I woke up. So maybe that's a concluding bookend to the opening dream.
Is it beyond rice that you're eating?
Yeah, he was kind of an antelope-like figure in many ways.
That's true. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. And we have to do this again, so we'll be in touch.
Thank you.
It was fascinating. We learned a lot tonight.
Okay, thank you, Alice. Thank you, everyone, for participating. Hope to see you again.
Okay.
2 thumbs up.
Okay. Good night. Bye.